Hello and welcome everybody to ICMDA webinars. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, which brings together around 60,000 Christian doctors and dentists in over 100 countries worldwide. And today on ICMDA webinars, we're privileged to have Dr. Mark Pickering speaking to us on the subject of lessons from the birth of medical mission. So it's a real privilege to have my old friend and colleague, Mark Pickering, with us today. And in terms of lessons that have come before, in the 1820s and 30s, early mission pioneers realized the immense value of combining the healing of the body with the preaching of the gospel, or maybe rediscovered it from the first century. And this led to the launch of the Medical Missionary Society in China, which influenced many others in the US, UK, and far beyond as well. And the modern medical missionary movement was born in the beginning of the 19th century. Its early history gives us many lessons that are valuable for contemporary challenges and also helps us reflect on current controversies in mission. And this webinar is going to expand on an article that Mark wrote for the CMF journal Triple Helix on the birth of modern medical mission. So Dr. Mark Pickering is a long friend and colleague in CMDA and in CMF UK and in ICMDA. He's currently the Chief Executive of Christian Medical Fellowship in the UK, position he's held for 4 years now. He's based in London, where he also works as a secure environment GP in prisons and similar institutions. He previously led student ministry for CMF UK and also for ICMDA, where he was student secretary at the turn of the last century. And in these roles, he's developed many partnerships with organizations in student ministry, bioethics and advocacy, global mission, and evangelism and apologetics. He's got a long-term interest in apologetics, particularly around biblical reliability, Islam, and science faith issues, and he has a great interest also in medical history, which is why we've asked him to give this talk. So Mark, real pleasure to have you with us today, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much, Pete. It is fantastic to be with you all. Thank you very much. I loved the ICMDA webinars over the time that they've been running, and it's a privilege to come and be on one. So we're looking at lessons from the birth of medical mission, as Pete's introduced, and specifically we're going to be looking at 15 lessons from the birth of medical mission in that early period in the 1800s. And now, you know, what might we learn from the 1800s? We might ask ourselves, in fact, what might we learn from history in general? Now, not everybody is as passionate as I am about history. And so it's well worth thinking about why we do that. So I think there is a sense in which we are all descended from those early pioneers of medical mission. I think we could probably all trace our history, certainly of our movements, back to some of the people that I'll be talking about today. And I want to quote two great Christian doctors before we go any further. Both of them have been doing my role in the past, the Chief Executive of the Christian Medical Fellowship, or the General Secretary as it was then. Douglas Johnson is the first one, and he was our first General Secretary back in 1949. And he did a history degree before he was a doctor, and he said that it is inexcusable in a Christian to neglect history. As he said, much of the Bible is history, and there's a reason for that we need to learn from it and to see what God has done. And another great Christian doctor, Peter Saunders, who I think many of you will know, said this: history repeats itself. It has to, because no one ever listens. And I think my hope and my prayer from today is that we will learn some of those lessons of history, because in doing so, not only will we give thanks to God, but hopefully we will avoid some of the mistakes that otherwise we may repeat. So back to the start, there is a long history of Christian doctors. I mentioned about going back to the 1820s, but of course it goes back further than that. And we've got St. Luke here. This is an early photograph, possibly from his medical school graduation ceremony. And he was, of course, the companion of the Apostle Paul, wrote the Gospel of Luke, the Book of Acts, and was the first Christian doctor. So many of us have looked to his example over the years, but many Christian doctors and other health carers over the medieval and early church period could also be told. There were lots of hospitals founded by Christians down the early centuries of Christianity, but a few of the medieval ones are still around today. And this one here in the top right hand corner, St. Thomas's Hospital, there it is on the banks of the River Thames, and you can see in the top left of the picture are the Houses of Parliament with Big Ben at the top of the screen there. And that's one of the hospitals that I trained at as a doctor, and that went right back to at least the 13th century. And you'll see below that's a picture of the previous buildings of that, but it goes back even further. So there is a great history of Christian healthcare, and many of these medieval hospitals were founded when the church was Catholic as we know it today. And then, of course, there was the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. And really what we're looking at here, particularly today, is what has happened in the Protestant times since the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. There were some great individual Christian doctors in those early centuries. I've put two of them here. Thomas Sydenham in the 17th century. He was known as the English Hippocrates. And when the plague came to London in the 1660s, just before the Great Fire of London, once he got his family to safety, he came back to London and treated plague victims at great risk to his own life. But it was his Christian faith that led him to do that. And then Edward Jenner, next to him in the 18th century, invented vaccinations, particularly with smallpox. That was the first illness that was vaccinated against. And again, he was a Christian whose faith drove him to do what he did. So some great individuals, but there wasn't really a movement after the Reformation. And so that's where we're looking at how that began and what lessons we can draw out from that. Christian doctors started to travel overseas to other countries in later centuries. Now, I mentioned about the Catholic Church, and you'll see there in the top left the Jesuits, which was a missionary order of the Catholic Church, which is still around today. And some of them traveled to East Asia, particularly to Japan and the Philippines in the 16th century, and they did some medical missionary work, we could call it, and founded some hospitals. But then in terms of Protestants, really the first person that we're talking about is this man called Caspar Schlegelmilch, which I think is a wonderful name to have. And he went to India in 1730, and he was part of a partnership between Danish people and Germans in South India in a place called Tranquebar. He was really the first Protestant Christian doctor who went abroad as a missionary. Now, his main task was to preserve the health of the other missionaries on the team, but one of the reasons we don't hear much about him was because he died within 3 weeks of arriving, and sadly that was the case for many of the early missionaries and early missionary doctors. They succumbed to the tropical diseases that they were going there to try and to treat. But coming down a little bit further, this chap in the bottom left, Dr. John Thomas, again, it's not a name that we tend to know very well, but his missionary partner is much better known, William Carey. William Carey, in many ways, is the founder of modern mission, and he founded the Baptist Medical Society in 1792. And William Carey was one of the two first missionaries sent out by the BMS, and he went to Bengal in what's now India in 1793. But a lot of people don't know that his partner there was John Thomas, and John Thomas had been a ship's doctor, He'd been working in India, and he'd been converted to Christianity whilst he was doing that. And then whilst he was out there, he engaged in missionary work in Calcutta. He came back to the UK, he met William Carey, the two of them hit it off. And actually that really impacted the direction of mission in the modern world, because many of us know that William Carey went back to Bengal, or went to Bengal. That wasn't his intention. He was going to go to Tahiti in the South Seas, and he would have done that were it not for John Thomas saying, no, we really need to go to India, and that's why he did that, and that's where that heritage comes from. Perhaps the first American missionary doctor was Dr. John Scudder, who went to India also in 1819, and a number of his descendants and family members were also medical missionaries and other kinds of missionaries out there. And you may know the name of Ida Scudder there on the right, who was his granddaughter, and she founded Vellore College, which is now the Christian Medical College in Vellore, which is a world renowned medical teaching institution there in India, and that all came from John Scudder and his legacy. So some real key individuals. We're starting to see Christian doctors going overseas as part of missionary activity and driven by their faith, and yet it wasn't a movement yet. But all of that changed in the 1820s and the 1830s, and really with another man that we don't tend to know very much about or talk about, and that's this man on the top right, Karl Gutzlaff. He was a German, I think, or possibly an Austrian, but he was working in Thailand and in China in the 1820s. And he wasn't a doctor, but as part of his missionary experience, he had gained some basic medical experience. And so he was able to put some of that to good use. And he was really the one that discovered the power of medical mission, because he saw that compassionate healthcare to people in particularly these countries where he worked in East Asia and Southeast Asia, they communicated far more than words. To go overseas as a strange foreigner, bringing this strange foreign religion, was not very well received by many of the indigenous peoples that he spoke to. But when he was able to heal some of their diseases, to treat the suffering that they were having, then that really spoke to them of a God of love, a God of compassion, and a God who could actually do things and help them. And so it wasn't just a case of buying his way into their affections or having a ticket to get in there. It was that combination of preaching and healing, which of course we see in Jesus's ministry and in the apostles' ministry, but he really rediscovered that there in Thailand and China in the 1820s. So he started to spread that concept of medical mission. And he was a great influence on many of the bigger names that we know about. So David Livingstone there, bottom left, who went to Africa with the London Missionary Society. In his application to be a missionary, he referenced the influence that Karl Gutzlaff had on him. And then Hudson Taylor, who founded the China Inland Mission, there in the bottom right, he also referred to Karl Gutzlaff as the founder of the movement, which he then went on to pioneer in inland China. And so my lesson from this point, lesson number 2, is that there was a time when medical mission was not there, and somebody had to think about it. It was new, it was strange, and it had to be, in a sense, invented or discovered. Karl Gutzlaff must have spent a long time wrestling with that, thinking, how would this work? Have I got this wrong? Am I really heading in the right direction? And of course we look back and we see that he was. But my question to each of you is, what might the Lord call each of us to do that has never been done before? What new opportunity might he give to us to put into action, whether it's small or large, that people in the future will look back on and thank the Lord for? So that's my second lesson. Moving on a little bit, or what was happening in the world at that time. Well, let's zoom out a little bit. This is one of the more uncomfortable factors about what was happening in the world at that time. It was really changing. A number of Western empires were growing. There were a growth of trade networks and military ventures based on those empires. And so there was increased contact between the USA and Europe on one hand, and Asia and Africa on the other hand. And of course, we're very much aware of some of the problems that that brought, and the tensions and controversies that that still brings today as we reevaluate that. But also it did bring opportunities, and we have to hold these two things in tension. That crest on the right there is the British East India Company, which was a private company, but in a sense, it almost functioned like a small empire itself. And so many of the, certainly members of the British Empire who were working overseas in India and in Asia were employees of that East India Company. In many ways, we can look at it like Paul's experience with the Roman Empire. Now, of course, none of us have lived through the Roman Empire. We don't quite get to feel just how bad it was, and the problems to do with that, in a sense that many of us do still with some of the Western Empire factors today. And yet the Roman Empire, for all of its problems, it did mean that you could travel easily around the Mediterranean world. You could communicate. Paul could write letters at one end of the Mediterranean and have them reliably transferred to the other to encourage the churches. And so as those roots of empire and trade and military expansion grew, Christians came with them. They were diplomats, they were traders, they were military personnel, they were missionaries, they were chaplains often to the other staff who were there, they were doctors, again often to the government or other military people who were there. And as these Christians came into contact with the peoples of Africa and Asia, they often came with their Christian faith and applied that to the problems that they were seeing. So the world was changing, and medicine was changing as well. Western medicine was advancing rapidly, so that there was a real opportunity for those who were coming into contact with people in many of these countries to reduce suffering in a way that they'd never been able to do before. The picture on the right is Edward Jenner vaccinating against smallpox, as I mentioned before, an incredibly important medical advancement, and there were many other things happening in the early 1800s. So my lesson there, lesson number 3, is that very often we will see that there are external forces, changing times, things way beyond our control, and big forces in the world, and they may be bad in themselves, they may be indifferent, they may be a mixture, but they will often bring with them opportunities. And so rather than us simply saying, oh dear, isn't the world going down the pan and getting worse, we should be asking ourselves, in all of the things that are changing, whether they be bad or good, what opportunities is the Lord bringing to us? We can be horizon scanning, looking at what is coming ahead and what is changing in our own situations and those around us, and thinking, what can we be doing? What opportunities might the Lord be leading us into? So that's my third lesson. What is the fourth one? Well, let's move to China. So that period in China was a real focus of some of the activity that we've talked about, and particularly the city of Canton. Forgive my pronunciation if that's wrong, Guangzhou as it's known today, and that's in South China. And you'll see there on the map there's 3 places that I've highlighted with the turquoise lines. You've got Canton up at the top, which is a large city at the mouth of the Pearl River Delta. And then further out down the Pearl River on the western side, you've got Macau, which was a Portuguese trading colony. And then you have Hong Kong on the east side. Now, Hong Kong was nothing like it is today. In those days, it was not owned by the British or governed by the British then. That was simply part of China, but we'll come on to that in a minute. But the significance of those places is that in Macau, you had Western people who had a degree of freedom. It was an independent Portuguese colony, and so there were many missionaries there and diplomats and others. And then in that city of Canton, that was pretty much the only place that Westerners could trade with China. There was a special trade area where the Westerners could live. And so into that enclave, missionaries went, and then some of the early doctors as well. And they did those early missionaries did some things like to begin a vaccination program and that kind of thing. But one person who really did change that was this man here at the bottom left, Dr. Thomas Richardson College. And he was one of those doctors who worked for the East India Company. And in many ways, they were a good employer. He had a good salary, he had plenty of free time. And as a Christian, he looked around him and thought, what can I do to benefit the Chinese? How can I use my training to reduce the suffering here? And how can I communicate the gospel to them as well? And he opened a couple of eye hospitals. So first in Macau and then in Canton, a year apart. The reason for that was that Chinese healthcare was very good in some ways in terms of herbal medicine, but they didn't have much to offer for eye disease. Their surgical skills were way behind what Thomas College and his colleagues were able to offer at that time. And so there was a lot of eye disease around that not much could be done with it. So it really made a difference, an impact in treating those diseases. You could also, of course, make a massive difference to someone's life by a relatively simple early cataract operation. And when I think about Thomas College, he had no idea where his career choices would lead him. You know, he just presumably just thought, all right, I'm a doctor, I'll go and work for the East India Company. Good chance to travel. He had no idea what an impact he would have and where it might lead to. And so as we make career choices, we may have absolutely no idea where the Lord might lead us. But if we make those choices in faith, trusting him that he will lead us into good places and do good things, give us opportunities, then we can trust him. And who knows what he will do. So I want us to be able to look at our career choices with a sense of excitement, even if some of them don't seem exciting at the time. So after those first early people there in Canton, here's another person who appeared. Now, Peter Parker, many of you will know him as Spider-Man's alter ego, but this is a different Peter Parker, Dr. Peter Parker, who was an American who was really what we call a new breed of medical missionary. And he was one of the first people to be dual trained, fully trained in theology and medicine, who went specifically with the aim of being a medical missionary. He had also been inspired by Carl Gutzlaff that we heard about. There was an early mission organization called the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, and Gutzlaff had spoken to them, he'd influenced them, helped them to see the value of sending out doctors, and Peter Parker was really the first one that they sent out. So he came to Canton in 1834. He met Gutzlaff, he met Thomas College, they teamed up, and frankly, the world was never the same again. He also opened an eye hospital, and you can see a drawing of it on the top right there. That eye hospital, the Canton Hospital, is still going today. It is, I think it was part of the first Western medical school in China, and also it was a world-leading institution for eye care, and I think is still going strong today. He also dealt with ear diseases, and because of his surgical skills, he did quite a bit of tumor removal as well. And you can see a couple of these incredible oil paintings there at the bottom. These are some of Peter Parker's actual patients. And the reason that we know about them is because I think it was the uncle of his Chinese assistant, or certainly a relative of one of his assistants, was a man called Lam Qua, who was a painter who'd been trained by a famous portrait painter, and he wanted to thank Peter Parker for what he had done for his countrymen, and Peter didn't want to take any payment, so he said, well, you can paint some of the pictures and help to publicize it. And some of these paintings are on view in Yale College in the US, where Parker was from, but some of them are on show at Guy's Hospital in London, and that was one of my training institutions as well, Guy's and St Thomas's hospitals together. So I remember these big oil paintings of these incredible tumors up in the pathology museum in my medical school, and at the time I had absolutely no idea of the significance of them, but I've been back and seen them more recently, and Pete Saunders has been in there with me and seen those, and there on a plaque on the wall there's a picture of Peter Parker and a little bit of the story of how that came to be there. So he brought his surgical skills, and together him and Dr. College and some of the others, they formed the Medical Missionary Society in China, the MMSC, in 1838. And that was the first medical missionary association in the world. And you can see there on the top right, that was one of their pamphlets that they published in 1838, right at the beginning. It was a really incredible venture because they brought in the local business community, both Christian and non-Christian, because people saw that, you know, whether they were Christians or not, this was actually good for international relationships. It was good for trade. It was good for international diplomacy. It was just good for people getting along together, for reducing the suspicion and hostility that there could be between the European and American expats and the local Chinese. And so a lot of people got behind that, and they printed appeals in the UK and the USA. They used to ask for pious physicians to come and join them. And I said they formed in 1838, and Thomas College, while he was really one of the two driving forces behind that and absolutely crucial in the setting up of it, he never even went to one of their meetings, because at the time they had their first public meeting, someone else had to deputize for him because he was preparing to return to Europe, and he did that, and he never returned to China. So the timing there is amazing, of how College's time there prepared the ground. He helped to mentor Peter Parker. They helped to found that organization together. But even as it was being founded, his time was done, and he was gone, and he passed it on to others. So that's my fifth lesson, because God really often does do some amazing things with timing and how he brings people together. The picture down at the bottom right is Thomas College's house in Cheltenham in the UK, where he retired to. And if you look very carefully down at the bottom of that bottom right hand window under the balcony, there is a small metal plaque that tells you that was Thomas College's house there. The other lesson I want to draw out from that is that good ideas often need some organization, some structure, some framework if they're really going to last, because bringing people together is great, inspiring them is great, but what happens when the first few people and the first flush of excitement goes away? We often have to put some kind of structure and framework behind it to help it continue on beyond the initial founders. So that was one of the great things that they did. They were very clear about how they wanted to start that and make it run. But not all was plain sailing, and I've mentioned a little bit about the dark forces of empire and trade, and these really came into force very soon after the MMSC was founded, because Western traders in China loved being there, because they could get silks, they could get spices, they can get lots of things that Europeans and Americans loved to buy, but there weren't actually many things that the Europeans had to sell to the Chinese that they really wanted. However, sadly, there was one thing that they had in abundance that they could sell to the Chinese, and that, what I'm afraid, was opium. So that's one of the very negative things that trade did, in that it got a generation of opium addicts in China. And the Chinese authorities, when they realized the problem, they resisted it, but very sadly, the British government forced it on them. It's a really dark history of the period in the history of the British involvement in China there. And they actually went to war over it. The first Opium War was when the British were basically going to war with the Chinese to force them to accept the opium that they wanted to sell. And that was between 1839 and 1842. It ended with the Treaty of Nanking, and that is when Hong Kong Island became a British possession. And obviously much has changed that's affected our history since then, but that is when Hong Kong came into British possession. So during that very dark period, Peter Parker had to leave Canton in 1840. Just before I say that, down in the bottom, if you wonder just what a problem it was, that is a picture of an opium warehouse, a British opium warehouse in India, which is where most of the opium was produced. They would make it in India, ship it across to China, and then sell it there. And you just see these bales stacked to the roof in this massive warehouse of opium. Absolutely shocking. So Peter Parker left Canton, But far from being the end of his ministry, in a sense, it was the beginning. And just like when Paul went to prison, it meant he had to write letters, and it spread his influence far and wide. Or when it took him to Rome to see the emperor, that just spread his influence further. And this is really what happened with Peter Parker. He went to the USA, he got married while he was there, he went to the UK, he went to France, promoting the cause and raising funds for it. And that trip in particular led to the creation of two separate medical mission organizations that had very different outcomes that we'll hear about in a minute. But that's my seventh lesson, that even when there are very bad things going on, bad situations, they can very much be used by God to bring about great good. Of course, the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the ultimate bad situations, and yet we know just how much good that was brought about by the Lord. So don't be despairing when bad things are happening. The Lord can still do great things with them. So this was the first of the organizations that came about. It was called the Syrian Medical Aid Association, and many of us will never have heard of that because it only lasted for 6 years. When Peter Parker came to London, there was actually quite a healthy reception. Lots of people had heard about what he was doing. They were positive about it. They had wealthy people who wanted to contribute to it. And Thomas Hodgkin, on the right here, he was a Quaker. He was a Christian. He was the pathologist at Guy's Hospital. He discovered, of course, Hodgkin's lymphoma. There's a histology slide at the bottom there. And so that's why we know his name together. But he was a really keen supporter of medical mission, and also a real keen supporter of the rights of indigenous peoples in and amongst the changes of empire. So he spent time in Canada, in Liberia, for instance, really campaigning for the rights of the indigenous peoples there as empire was spreading. And I said they had early success and wealthy backers. They sent 2 missionary doctors out to Lebanon and then to Damascus, and they really got started very quickly. And yet they went too far, they went too fast, and they simply hadn't thought it through. They hadn't anticipated the complexities, they hadn't anticipated how to do it, what would go wrong, etc. I think both of their doctors ended up going into private practice in the area. And so basically it evaporated by 1847, and it left Thomas Hodgkin personally in deep debt from his financing of it. So my lesson from that is that great ideas can go horribly wrong if the details aren't thought through. It's not enough just to have a really good idea. I think it says in Proverbs that through many counselors, I forget the rest of it, but basically things go well if we have many counselors, and if they don't, often things can fall apart. So do think through the details and the implications of the great idea that the Lord might have given you. But Parker also went to Edinburgh, also in 1841, and there's a much happier story. The Edinburgh Medical Missionary Society was formed out of a committee that came from his visit there, and they did it very differently. They didn't rush to appoint doctors and send them out. I think they did try, but they couldn't find people, so they just said, okay, fine, we'll take it slower. We'll promote the concept of medical mission. We'll raise funds. They did fundraising for Peter Parker's ventures in China and also for the Syrian Medical Aid Association. But they supported students as well. They did an essay competition for medical school students about the value of medical mission. They built it up slowly and steadily. And one of those students who came up through EMMS was this man at the top right, Kalust Vartan. Armenian name there, and he was a student. He stayed in their hostel, and he went on to found the Nazareth Hospital in Israel in 1861, I think. And both EMMS and Nazareth Hospital are still going strong today. So they did it in a very different way. They built slowly and steadily. They focused on the next generation. And that's my 9th lesson. If we do that, we build slowly, we focus on the next generation, very often we can produce lasting results. Just a brief interlude there. One good movement encourages another. In one of the other articles that you'll see at the end, one of the first, or the real beginnings of the Christian Medical Fellowship in the UK was what's called the Christian Medical Association, which started in 1854 with this man on the right, Dr. Golding Bird. And there was a student Bible class at Guy's Hospital. They were asking around for the doctors about who could support them, and one student wrote in the British Medical Journal about how hard it was being a student and how who could help him with his moral development as well as his medical development. And Goldingberg saw that, he responded to it. He helped the students in the Guy's Bible class to found the Christian Medical Association. But as he responded in that letters column, the committee in EMMS in Edinburgh, they read about that, they heard of him, and they wrote to encourage him. And it was such a wonderful touch there that just hours before the second meeting of his colleagues to say, can we start something for Christian doctors and students? They got this letter from Edinburgh saying, yes, go for it. We're right behind you, telling him a bit about what they did. And that was such an encouragement to him. It was really the first full CMF or CMDA in the world, as far as I'm aware, in 1854. And again, there's God's amazing timing there, because Goldingberg launched the CMA in 1854, and months later he was dead at age 39 from the complications of rheumatic fever. So God's amazing timing there as well. But my lesson here is that the people in Edinburgh, they didn't try to come down and start the Christian Medical Association. They stuck to they stayed in their lane, as it were, but they were really happy to encourage him in his. And you may see that other people are starting out in doing something that you would love to see happen. You haven't got the time to do it yourself, but we can encourage others to realize the vision that God has given them. So that's lesson number 10. Continuing in Edinburgh, there's another great hero here called William Burns Thompson there on the right. I'm going to call him WBT. He was training as a normal theological missionary in the slums of Edinburgh, and one day he realized through a chance interaction that actually it was very hard for him to come in as a missionary into these inner city slums, these hardened working class areas, and just tell them about the God who loved them. Often people will be thrown out and sometimes beaten up by the people that they listened to. But one day he just noticed that a woman wasn't looking well, and he asked her if she had tried any medicine, and she took him for a doctor, and her demeanor instantly changed. He went and got her some castor oil from the local dispensary, and she was forever grateful. And then the next time he went back, he told her the gospel, and she accepted it. So he switched to training as a doctor, and he became the superintendent of a dispensary that was started by another Christian doctor in Edinburgh in 1853. And they saw very quickly that they could train students there the practicalities of medical work in these poor inner city areas, but also in theology and in evangelism. And they trained generations of students there with William Burns Thompson mentoring them. First they lived out in their own accommodation, but then he saw it was much better to bring them into a hostel, to train them in community and mentor them. And that meant that they really stayed the course better and retained their desire. And many of them went overseas as medical missionaries, like Dr. Vartan to Nazareth that we heard about. Down in the bottom there, that is a picture of what became the Livingston Memorial Institute there in Edinburgh. So my 11th lesson there is, if we build community, if we marry together theory and practice, the result will often be dynamite. Bit more on medical mission, because this was clearly a concept that was working well in Edinburgh, and whilst that dispensary in Edinburgh remained the mother institution and William Burns Thompson was the driving force, it was replicated really throughout the UK in the next 15 to 20 years. And so I've listed out some of the cities where that was replicated, and thousands of poor people were treated medically. They heard the gospel in these really dire inner city slums in the Industrial Revolution, when situations were terrible and many of them couldn't afford a doctor, long before we had the National Health Service in 1948. And those who'd been trained in these inner city home medical missions, as they called them, they would then go overseas, and many of them would start similar Christian dispensaries in inner cities like Madras and other places. And top right there's one in North London in the Islington Medical Mission. that replicated in many places. And William Burns Thompson, he also traveled. He was the one who went round and spread the idea and got other people to start it up and encourage them, almost like the Apostle Paul going around founding churches and then encouraging them. He's very much in a similar model. And he started this publication on the right there, the Medical Missionary Journal, which was a wonderful publication. I've got some of the original volumes there here on my desk, and he would bring together letters from medical missionaries, talk about what was happening, share encouragements from around the world, and he would encourage his students, his former students, the supporters who wanted to give money to it. And that was really a massive part of the influence that he had. So that there is my 12th lesson, that if you've got a good idea in one place, you may not be able to do it everywhere, but you can replicate it. If you communicate and share the vision, as Dr. Burns Thompson did, then other things will the Holy Spirit will often take over. So we started with these home medical mission dispensaries, really outpatients, simple outpatients or primary care units in inner cities, but very soon that turned into something bigger. The first medical mission in London was in 1871, and the second was in a place called Bethnal Green in the east of London in 1874. There's a picture of that where the first medical mission, the second one started in Bethnal Green there, up in that awful bit of slum housing there. But then within a few years it had become what's known as the Mildmay Mission Hospital, because the outpatients needed inpatient care, and it grew and it grew and it grew, and that building has gone through several iterations there, and it's trained generation of missionary nurses. My own mum trained there at the Mildmay Mission Hospital and then went to North Africa. Many doctors have been trained there for the mission field, and the gospel has been shared. And many of these smaller hospitals didn't survive the National Health Service in 1948, and they were absorbed into bigger hospitals or closed down. But the Mildmay did, and it reinvented itself in future decades as a world leader in HIV care. Some of you will remember Princess Diana used to come there in the days when HIV was much more scary and not many people wanted to be part of it, but she really helped to promote the work of the Mildmay Mission Hospital. And now that inpatient HIV care is not so well needed, they're reinventing themselves again with step-down homeless care and detox pathways for homeless people who need a stable place to do that in a loving environment. So that's my lesson number 13, that good ideas can grow, they can adapt to changing circumstances. And if we're seeking God, if we're doing the small things well, then the bigger things will often follow. So 2 more lessons left, and this is really into the 1870s, and another one of my heroes, Dr. George Saunders, no relation to Peter. I have checked that up. He was a Christian military doctor there, so there he is with his medals. He worked in the Crimean War in Russia and Ukraine in the 1850s, and there's a great story in his autobiography of how he became ill himself. He was brought back to the hospital at Scutari in what's now Istanbul, and although it had been terrible before, he wrote about how it had been transformed since the arrival of Miss Florence Nightingale and her nurses. So he really benefited from that. He retired from the military in London in 1871, and he became the superintendent of that London medical mission. And I've got a picture of that on the right-hand side. It's still there in Covent Garden in Theatreland in London. The building's still there. You can see it says London Medical Mission Dispensary there. The fun fact is that it is now London's oldest fish and chip shop, and that is the building there today. And in that building, while it was a medical mission and a mission house as well, George Saunders did great things. Apart from the medical mission, he actually launched the Medical Prayer Union, which was the successor to the Christian Medical Association and the forerunner to CMF, because that the CMA had founded and fell apart, and it had to be done again for a new generation. He also saw the benefits of medical mission overseas, and so he was one of the people who founded again in that building the Medical Missionary Association in 1878, which was the London version of what was going on in Edinburgh, which ran for 126 years until it merged with CMF in 2004. So that's legacy is very much going strong. So my 14th lesson there is that with God, you can change the world in your retirement. Never say I'm too old to do something amazing. So just finally, my one lesson is, I suppose, the controversial one. We've heard there's some amazing stories of service, of sacrifice, of God's providence, and yet as we look back at what happened in the 1820s, the 1830s, and beyond, much of it seems dated, and much of it is quite uncomfortable. We talked about the problems and the dark forces of the empires that were going on in that time. And of course, that is easy for us to see. And all of those early missionaries I've talked about, they were all white men from Europe and the USA. Many of them had indigenous assistants. You can see there Thomas College there. You can see his Chinese assistant in the background, Peter Parker. Similarly, some of those are known about, named, but nothing like to the degree that the Europeans and Americans were. And so that's certainly something that we need to think carefully about. And inextricably, some of what happened was linked to those problems of empires and trade. And of course, we're right to reappraise this in the light of history. It's so easy for us still even today to have Western savior or white savior complexes and assumptions about how we're going to go and save what's happening in these poorer countries, and that just seems incredibly patronizing these days, and we really need to rethink that very much. In CMF, we're doing that. We have a Western Saviours working group thinking about how we can operate with global humility and partnership there, because of course Scripture reminds us that we are a global community. And we have this phrase in England that you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, just because the water in the bathtub may be dirty and smelly, and you want to get rid of that. Please don't throw away the baby that's just being cleaned. Of course, medical mission has evolved greatly over the years, and so we see a very different situation now. We've got national churches and health services. That's a picture from India. The Christian Medical Association of India there is engaging in flood relief and mission clinics there. International educational partnerships in groups like Prime, and of course our very own ICMDA, which is a partnership of 84 member movements and growing. So that's my final lesson, really, that we've got to, of course, be willing to reevaluate what's happened in the light of history, and reevaluate it in the light of Scripture. We have to adapt and evolve, and sometimes take a different turning or admit when we've made mistakes. But we have to retain the best, and there's still so much to be thankful to for the Lord. So that's my 15 lessons from the birth of medical mission. These will be in the show notes. These are the 3 articles that I've drawn on that are in the CMF journal, Triple Helix. There'll be further ones coming out over the next year or so. And thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Mark, for an amazing overview of the very early days of Healthcare Mission, how it started. And I know that you've unearthed many facts I certainly wasn't aware of in the last year or so, even with regard to the birth of Christian Medical Fellowship, this discovery that it was originally the Christian Medical Association. Just, we're aware in the UK how much the National Health Service was the product of Christian initiatives. It was a whole lot of hospitals that were in effect nationalized by the government that were originally Christian hospitals. But what's your feeling about the health services in other countries? To what extent have Christian hospitals provided the framework for other national health initiatives?
Well, I know much less about that, so I'm very happy to defer to others. I mean, I'm aware that there's a great history of mission hospitals in so many countries, and that they again have adapted and been maybe started by expats and then taken over by the national churches and medical associations. So I think it's another example of the great legacy there is. When I do a study on that, I'll let you know.
Okay, I think it was fascinating too. We often think about Healthcare Mission, particularly with regard to South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, but also sub-Saharan Africa as well. But the way you've told the story, it really began in East Asia, in China, where a lot of the original lessons were were learnt, and where there aren't that many mission hospitals today. But isn't that fascinating?
It is, yeah. It was a surprise to me.
So Claudia Stein is saying, thank you, Mark. There's lots of people saying thanks for the talk. Thanks for this wonderful presentation overview on medical mission. Are there any data on reverse missionaries? That is, Christian healthcare workers coming to Europe, the spiritually darkest continent, from other parts of the world in our present time. And I know you've concentrated very much on the very early history of healthcare mission, but would you like to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There are some vast numbers of people coming, to Europe and the UK and the USA from many of the countries that previously, medical missionaries went to. We have many CMF members who have graduated in countries such as India, Pakistan, the Philippines, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Ghana, and lots of other places as well. And I think that we love having them as part of our own multi-ethnic national CMF. And I think the challenge for us often is connecting with them and bringing them in together and thinking, well, how do we need to adapt to make it more comfortable for Indian Christians and Filipino Christians, because obviously the culture might be different, the worship songs might be different, the church networks they're in might be different. So again, I don't have the data on that. I just see with my own eyes that there is so much opportunity for us. And I know within ICMDA there is massive opportunity of people going all over the globe, and people training from Africa, training in Bulgarian medical schools, and having access to the gospel in places that they would never have done before, or coming from the Middle East to Europe. And that's that kind of thing.
Yes, mission's really exploding now, isn't it? From everywhere to everywhere, and it's fascinating to see how it all began. Dan O'Neill is saying, thanks for this great overview of history. The East India Company's catchphrase was, with God leading, nothing will harm us. Did this lead, he asked, to better acceptance of Christian employees expressing the gospel then? And is it harder now in our secular healthcare systems?
Yeah, it's a really good question, isn't it? And that's not an element that I've done a great study on, but I think I've certainly seen parts of that. And I guess, like in many of these situations, when a lot of what was happening there was nominal Christianity, people would put it on their mottos and that sort of thing, and they would see themselves as a Christian nation, but how much that penetrated to the heart was a very different thing. And I think many of the real Christians, the evangelicals and the keen people there, they would often be highlighting the abuses that were going on of the indigenous peoples, or how the trade was being poorly done. Peter Parker actually moved away a little bit, or to some extent, from the medical side and became a diplomat. So he was, I think he was effectively the first American ambassador to China, because he got involved in these diplomacy things and just trying to have good interactions between the countries. But then George Saunders, that I mentioned, he tells the story of how, even in Victorian Britain, when he was sharing Bibles and evangelizing people in the military, he basically got told to stop. He carried on anyway, but he was told to stop by his superiors because he was being too keen. So I think there's always, even in a nominally Christian place, it gives us opportunities, it gives us doors to open, but there'll always be a place where we have to have courage and boldness and wisdom.
Yes, we can't fall into the trap of thinking in the good old days everything was easier, because of course we know the story in China that there was a terrible persecution during the Cultural Revolution, and a lot of these early initiatives were Christian missionaries were driven out of that country. Aaron Poppleton, who you know well, is he's had to leave early for his clinic already, but has promised to come back and listen to the recording, which will be available tomorrow. But your thoughts on the future of medical mission? Do you foresee particular challenges or opportunities? Well, that's a huge question, isn't it? But
yeah.
What were the other lessons that you've outlined? What were the things that struck you
Well,
most.
I think that 15th lesson, the one about reappraising the history in the light of what's going on today, so many people are, thinking about this from a decolonization agenda, or, the medical mission is done, Europeans and Americans shouldn't be going overseas and exporting colonialism. Of course, we shouldn't be doing that. However, we need to be reappraising and thinking, well, what does it mean in this, in this day and age to be able to encourage in global partnerships? I was really privileged just a couple of weeks ago to have the secretary of the Cuban CMF here in this office. He was over for another non-medical conference. He told Peter that he was there. Pete put him in touch, so we just brought him in here. We just had a great afternoon just encouraging each other. And for them, I didn't have to go there. He came here and just to say, here's a few ideas for what you might do. Here's some resources, and we're praying for you. That was incredible. So, we see so many partnership opportunities, and I think so much of that is through groups like ICMDA, when many of the countries who in the former years would have had people from the West going over and doing the healthcare. Now it's about, well, is there specialist stuff that we can help train you with? Is there stuff in terms of healthcare delivery that we might be a little bit further on with? Very often we're learning from our brothers and sisters in other countries. How do we avoid doing stupid stuff in this situation, because you're the ones who can help to teach us. And I just love the partnership that we have through ICMDA and how we can really learn from each other. Shameless plug for the World Congress. If you want to come and learn from each other, be there in Tanzania in June.
Yes, it's certainly not too late to book, and all the information is on the ICMDA website. It was striking with these earliest pioneers of medical mission, how initially they went as effectively as evangelists and church planters and added the medicine on. There's a couple of people have picked up this the question: have we lost the evangelistic Christian discipleship side of it? Is there a danger of just promoting medicine as service and divorcing it from the gospel?
Yeah, I think there is always danger in doing that, isn't there? And just to be that nice doctor, I think every one of us has that challenge there. Even in countries that are open, we can just not talk about our faith because people don't want to do that for reasons of apathy or opposition or that sort of thing. Of course, we need to do good medicine. But just like we learn about in the Saline Solution training, there are so many ways that we can do that, dropping in faith flags, just talking or mentioning the fact that we've been at church or that we prayed or that we are a Christian. And then that helps to sow those seeds. And then the Lord will help us in our own situations to think, well, how can I take this opportunity, show a bit more courage here, get into this conversation that might help my friend or my colleague. That it may not be that we can do the clinic and then preach and give out Bibles, as they often did in many of these early situations, but there's always a way to do that, and the Lord will guide us as we seek to adapt to the times.
Well, Mark, thanks so much. It's fascinating. It's inspiring. I find it's incredibly encouraging as well to see the way that God worked through these individuals who were prepared just to obey in their own small way, and out of whom great institutions have been built, and many thousands of others have followed in their footsteps later on. And sadly, we've run out of time today, but thank you so much, Mark, for your time and energy and leadership in this whole area. So it just remains for me to say again, thank you for everyone for coming along today, for bringing your questions, and we look forward to seeing you again soon on ICMDA webinars. May the Lord bless you.